Look closely at a photograph of a human eye. Not the color, not the size, just the shape of the skin around it. Specifically the small fold of tissue at the inner corner where the upper eyelid meets the bridge of the nose. In some people, that corner is fully exposed, the pink inner edge clearly visible. In others, a thin flap of skin drapes softly over it, partially covering it, subtly changing the entire visual shape of the eye. That single anatomical feature has a name. Scientists call it the epicanthic fold, and it is one of the most commonly noticed, most frequently misunderstood pieces of human variation on the planet. It is often described casually as an Asian trait. Almond-shaped eyes, people say, as though it were a simple, exclusive marker of one part of the world. But here's the first thing that makes this story genuinely interesting. That description is not accurate, not even close. The epicanthic fold appears in the San people of southern Africa, thousands of miles from Asia. It appears in indigenous populations across the Americas. It appears in parts of Scandinavia, in some northern European families with no East Asian ancestry whatsoever. It appears in populations across Central Asia, Siberia, and the Pacific. And here's the part almost nobody knows: every single human being, regardless of ancestry, has an epicanthic fold at one point in their life, in the womb, during a specific window of fetal development. Essentially, all human fetuses display a fold of skin at the inner corner of the eye. In many populations, that fold recedes and disappears before or shortly after birth, as the bridge of the nose grows upward and outward, stretching the skin taut and pulling the fold away. In other populations, it stays. This single fact that the fold is the human default rather than a specialized addition quietly dismantles the most common assumption people carry about this trait. Everyone starts with it. In many populations, it simply goes away. So the actual scientific question is not, why do some people have this feature? The question properly asked is far stranger. Why does a structure that every human starts with disappear in some populations and persist in others? If you enjoy this kind of thing, the questions where the popular answer turns out to be the incorrect one, take a second to subscribe to the channel, so the next one finds you. Now, let's look at what is actually going on with this fold of skin. And the honest answer, after more than a century of investigation, is that scientists still do not fully know. But the theories, the evidence for and against each of them, and the reasons the most popular explanation is probably wrong, make for one of the more fascinating unresolved puzzles in human biology. First, some anatomy, because the popular description of this trait is imprecise in a way that matters. What people casually call almond-shaped eyes is not one feature. It is a combination of at least 3 separate anatomical variables, each independently variable, and each present in different degrees across every population on Earth. The first is the epicanthic fold itself, that flap of skin covering the inner corner. The second is the amount of fatty tissue and connective tissue in the upper eyelid, which affects how full or how thin the lid appears. The third involves a small tendon called the levator aponeurosis, the structure that lifts the eyelid and specifically where that tendon attaches to the skin. In some people, it attaches higher, creating a visible crease, what people commonly call a double eyelid. In others, it attaches lower or blends differently into the tissue, producing a smooth lid with no visible crease, a single eyelid. Before we go further, I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Think about your own family, your parents, your siblings, your cousins, people who share your exact ancestry. How much do their eyes actually differ from each other? On these 3 features, drop it in the comments, because I suspect the honest answers are going to contradict almost everything people assume about how this trait works. These 3 variables combine in enormous numbers of ways. And here's the crucial detail that undermines the entire idea of a single Asian eye shape. All 3 of them vary dramatically within East Asian populations themselves. Somewhere between roughly 1/3 and half of people of East Asian descent, depending on the specific population studied, have a natural visible eyelid crease. Many have no epicanthic fold at all. Siblings raised in the same family, sharing the same parents, frequently differ from each other on all 3 of these traits. The variation within any given population, in other words, is enormous, frequently larger than the average difference between populations, which is the same pattern found across nearly every human physical trait scientists have ever bothered to measure carefully. Now, to the actual theories. The most famous explanation, the one repeated in countless textbooks, documentaries, and casual conversations for over a century, is the cold adaptation hypothesis. The argument goes like this: populations that spent tens of thousands of years in the extreme cold of Siberia and Central Asia faced brutal conditions, freezing wind, blowing snow, and intense glare reflecting off ice, an epicanthic fold. The theory suggests provided a layer of insulating protection over the delicate inner corner of the eye, while narrowing the eye opening slightly, reducing snow glare in the same way a squint does. It is an appealing story. It is simple, it sounds mechanically plausible, and it fits a satisfying narrative of humans adapting to harsh environments. It is also, by the standards of current evidence, quite likely wrong. The single biggest problem is geographic. The San people of the Kalahari region in southern Africa frequently display epicanthic folds. The Kalahari is not a frozen tundra, it is a semi-arid desert. Whatever selected for this trait in southern Africa, it was very obviously not snow glare or sub-zero wind. The same problem appears elsewhere. Epicanthic folds occur in populations across Southeast Asia, in tropical, humid environments with no meaningful cold season at all, in indigenous groups across warm regions of the Americas, and in populations that have no long history of Arctic living whatsoever. Meanwhile, some populations with genuinely deep histories in extreme cold, certain groups in Northern Europe among them, do not show the trait at high frequencies. The correlation, in other words, simply does not hold. And a hypothesis that fails to predict where a trait actually appears is a hypothesis in serious trouble. Researchers have also pointed out a mechanical problem with the theory. The measurable insulating effect of a thin flap of skin over the inner corner of the eye is realistically extremely small. It is difficult to construct a convincing argument that such a marginal thermal benefit could drive strong natural selection across tens of thousands of years, particularly when human populations in extreme cold solve the problem far more effectively through clothing, shelter, and behavior. There is a broader lesson buried in this, one that historians of science point to regularly. The cold adaptation hypothesis was formulated in an era when researchers were actively looking for adaptive explanations for visible differences between human populations, and it survived for decades largely on the strength of sounding reasonable rather than on the strength of its evidence. When later researchers finally tested its central prediction that the trait should track cold climates, the prediction failed. It did not fail subtly, it failed in the Kalahari, in Southeast Asia, in the Americas, and in Northern Europe all at once. So, if not cold, then what? The second theory is more mechanical and more interesting, and it centers not on the eye at all, but on the nose. Remember what happens in fetal development. The fold disappears in many people as the bridge of the nose grows upward, physically stretching the skin and pulling the fold flat. This suggests something important. The epicanthic fold may not be a separate trait that some populations acquired at all. It may simply be what happens by default when the nasal bridge develops with a lower profile. There is a documented correlation supporting this. Populations with, on average, lower nasal bridges tend to show higher frequencies of epicanthic folds. Populations with higher, more projecting nasal bridges tend to show lower frequencies. If that relationship holds, then this entire question changes shape completely. The fold would not be something that evolved for a purpose. It would be a byproduct, a structural consequence of nasal architecture, no more independently selected than the shape of your earlobe is selected for hearing. Scientists have a term for this kind of thing. They call it a spandrel, borrowing an architectural term, a feature that exists not because it was selected for, but because it is the inevitable structural result of something else that was. Which raises the obvious next question. Was the nose itself under selection? Possibly. There is genuine evidence that nasal shape across human populations correlates with historical climate, particularly humidity and temperature, since one function of the nasal passage is conditioning air before it reaches the lungs. Populations in cold, dry environments tend on average toward narrower nasal passages. Populations in warm, humid environments tend toward wider ones. But even this relationship is far messier than the neat version usually presented, with substantial exceptions, and enormous individual variation inside every single population studied. The third theory involves genetics, and here the evidence gets considerably more concrete. In 2013, a research team published findings on a specific gene variant called EDAR, and more precisely a version of it known as V370A, which is present at high frequencies in East Asian and indigenous American populations and rare almost everywhere else. Genetic analysis suggests this variant arose somewhere in Asia roughly 30,000 years ago and then spread rapidly, showing signatures of strong positive selection, meaning something about it conferred a real advantage or was at least strongly favored. Researchers tested this variant directly by engineering it into mice, and the results were striking. The mice developed noticeably thicker hair, increased numbers of sweat glands, changes in mammary gland tissue, and altered tooth shape. That last one connects to something archaeologists had already documented. Populations carrying this variant show high frequencies of shovel-shaped incisors, front teeth with a distinctive scooped, ridged back surface, a feature clearly visible in ancient human remains and long used by researchers as a population marker. So EDAR is real. Its effects are documented, and it is genuinely concentrated in specific populations. But here's the honest caveat, and it matters. EDAR's confirmed effects involve hair, sweat glands, teeth, and mammary tissue. It has not been established that this variant directly produces the epicanthic fold. Some researchers suspect a connection, given the gene's broad effects on skin and ectodermal tissue development, but the direct causal link at present is suggested rather than proven. And even setting that aside, an enormous question remains unanswered. Why did EDAR spread so successfully in the first place? The leading hypotheses focus on sweat glands, the idea being that increased sweat gland density offered a genuine thermoregulatory advantage in humid environments. Others point to the mammary tissue changes, which could have improved infant nutrition. Some researchers have proposed sexual selection, thicker hair being culturally preferred over many generations. There is no consensus. There is only an unusually well-documented gene, doing several things at once, spreading rapidly for reasons still being argued over in the literature. It is worth pausing on how ordinary that situation actually is in genetics. Genes very rarely do one clean thing. A single variant can influence hair, skin, glands, and teeth simultaneously, and selection acting on any one of those effects will drag all the others along with it, whether they are useful, useless, or entirely incidental. Which brings us to a fourth possibility, the one that scientists tend to find least satisfying emotionally and most defensible logically: genetic drift. Not every human trait exists for a reason. Not every difference between populations reflects some clever adaptation to some ancient environmental pressure. Sometimes a trait spreads because a small founding population happened to carry it, and that population happened to expand into a large region. Sometimes a variant rides along with a genuinely useful neighboring gene, purely because of physical proximity on a chromosome. Sometimes a trait becomes common through nothing more than accumulated statistical chance across thousands of generations of ordinary reproduction. Human populations have repeatedly gone through bottlenecks, migrations, isolations, and expansions, and every one of those events reshuffles trait frequencies in ways that have nothing whatsoever to do with survival advantage. The strong scientific instinct is always to ask, what is this for? But biology's honest answer, more often than most people expect, is simply it is not for anything. It just happened, and then it stayed. Step back and look at the whole picture. And something clarifies the trait every human starts with in the womb. The trait that appears across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. The trait that varies enormously between siblings. The trait whose most famous explanation collapses the moment you check its geographic predictions. The trait that may not even be a trait at all, but a structural consequence of nasal development. None of that resembles the tidy story of a distinctive Asian feature evolved for Siberian snow. It resembles something far more accurate and far more human. A continuous overlapping spectrum of variation, present in every population on Earth at different frequencies, produced by a tangle of development, genetics, chance, and possibly some selection nobody has yet pinned down. Every human trait scientists have examined closely enough follows this same pattern. The boundaries people assume exist keep dissolving under measurement. The variation inside groups keeps exceeding the variation between them. The clean categories keep turning out to be artifacts of how we look, rather than features of what is actually there. Somewhere, right now, a fetus is developing a fold of skin at the inner corner of its eye, exactly as every human fetus has for as long as our species has existed. Whether that fold stays or fades over the coming months depends on developmental processes still not fully understood. Influenced by genes still being mapped, shaped by an evolutionary history nobody has fully reconstructed. The only thing science can say with genuine confidence is that whatever happens next, it will not make that child a different kind of human. It will simply make them one more point in a spectrum of variation that has never once had the sharp edges people keep insisting they can see.